On the subject of taking on literature, this is a poem about reasonable people. The reasonable people are coming. The reasonable people have eyes and mouths. The reasonable people remember their lessons. The reasonable people have a few questions for you. The reasonable people are on a waiting list for stray dog adoption. The reasonable people have proved their suitability. The reasonable people are worried. The reasonable people have concerns. The concerns are reasonable. The reasonable people began asking questions. The reasonable people went to one meeting. The protest outside was not reasonable. The protest frightened the reasonable people. The reasonable people were never political before. The reasonable people think it's important to weigh the arguments. The reasonable people say it's such a shame that things have become so heated. The reasonable people have chapped hands from so much washing. The reasonable people are inspired. It's been a long time since the reasonable people went dancing. The reasonable people are hopeful. The reasonable people are learning so much. The reasonable people believe in public service. The reasonable people are on public boards. The reasonable people are proud of their position on public boards. The reasonable people suggest you do not enter the building. The reasonable people are treasurers. The reasonable people hold an investigation. The reasonable people are cleared by the investigation. The investigation was reasonable. The reasonable people call HR. The reasonable people do not believe it is the funder's role. The reasonable people just want to give everyone involved a hug. The reasonable people list everything they have done for you. You unfriend the reasonable people. The reasonable people have blocked you. The reasonable people just want to get away from it all. The reasonable people miss coffee mornings. The reasonable people have lost their pencil sharpeners. The reasonable people have beautiful singing voices. The reasonable people are on internet forums at 11 p.m. looking for advice on their unsleeping children. The reasonable people are on internet forums at 11:30 p.m. discussing the cracks in your body. The reasonable people are on internet forums at midnight planning a letter writing campaign about bullying. The reasonable people think that no one should have to face abuse. The reasonable people think you have a prejudice against mums. The reasonable people take notes. The reasonable people read the whole shortlist last year but just don't have the energy for it this time round. The reasonable people email you at 3 a.m. to say you are not safe. The reasonable people are afraid of you. The reasonable people ask what is wrong with you. The reasonable people say that you believe in violence. The reasonable people say you have orchestrated a campaign of hate. The reasonable people have been abused. The reasonable people have been abused on social media. The reasonable people have been threatened. The reasonable people have columns. The reasonable people are building a temple on the hill. The reasonable people go for long walks. The reasonable people have collections of pressed flowers. The reasonable people would never. The reasonable people would never. The reasonable people would never advocate for policies of elimination, but they understand and sympathize with the reasons such policies exist. The reasonable people understand. The reasonable people sympathize. The reasonable people understand and sympathize. The reasonable people are heroes. The reasonable people have avatars. The reasonable people are ascending. The reasonable people put up their Christmas tree early this year. The reasonable people wear masks. The reasonable people are angry about the referendum. The reasonable people crowdfund a judicial review. The reasonable people say that one suicide is one suicide too many. The reasonable people blame the institutionalization of this pernicious ideology. The reasonable people ask how they can support you. The reasonable people say, of course, they support you. The reasonable people promise to try hard to get your name right. The reasonable people do not speak your name. The reasonable people publish editorials. The reasonable people publish editorials about abuse. The reasonable people give out awards. The reasonable people do not condone prejudice and hatred. The reasonable people are afraid of being silenced. The reasonable people think your overreaction is dangerous. The reasonable people will not meet with you to talk. The reasonable people will not apologize. The reasonable people are defending liberty. The reasonable people think it's just common sense. The reasonable people are afraid of dentists. The reasonable people try very hard to go to the dentist regularly, but then, this pandemic. The reasonable people watch Question Time. The reasonable people orchestrate the takeover of the internal machinery of the party of government. The reasonable people have persistent sinus infections, and when they phone their GPs, embarrassed at using the precious resource of NHS time, the GPs recommend menthol sweets. The miserable people make a bulk order of menthol sweets on Amazon. The reasonable people have many, many limbs. The reasonable people are just worried about the integrity of your body. The reasonable people enjoy crime fiction. The reasonable people take power. The power is reasonable. The reasonable people's favourite succulents died last week. The reasonable people believe that polarisation is dangerous. The reasonable people are walking down the street. The reasonable people are alive with light. The reasonable people are at your door. The reasonable people are so glad he's gone. The reasonable people are on your side. The reasonable people are singing, singing. The reasonable people are coming. The reasonable people are here.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, we'd appreciate it if you could hit the like button, if you could hit the subscribe button, and make sure to ring that bell icon so you don't miss any updates from us in the future. If you want to go that extra mile and support us a little further, we do have a Patreon channel with loads of exclusive goodies, and you can sign up for as little as $1 a month. We appreciate your help, guys, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.